We are very fortunate to have our next speaker here today to deliver the keynote address. Krystal Tsosie is an Indigenous geneticist bioethicist and assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. As an advocate for Indigenous genomic data sovereignty, she co-founded the first US Indigenous-led biobank, a nonprofit research institution called the Native BioData Consortium. Her research can be encapsulated in two main foci: Indigenous population genetics and bioethics. In particular, she focuses on bioethical engagement of Indigenous communities in genomics and data science to build trust. Her interest is in integrating genomic and data approaches to assess Indigenous variation contributing to health inequities. She began her research career in the lab, where she developed and patented a combined targeted ultrasound imaging and chemotherapeutic drug delivery device for treating early metastases in cancer. Upon seeing the disparities in emerging genomic technologies, she switched fields to genetic epidemiology, public health, and bioethics. Her first Master's of Arts in Bioethics at Arizona State University focused on the cultural implications of genetics in Native American communities. She added biostatistical knowledge and computational programming in large genomic data sets during her second Master's in Public Health in Genetic Epidemiology at Vanderbilt University. She co-led an ongoing longitudinal genetic study and other community-based work with tribal nations in North and South Dakota. Her research and educational endeavors have received increasing national and international media attention as scientists worldwide are understanding the importance of equitable, community-based engagement models and the importance of Indigenous genomic data sovereignty. Her work has been covered by popular media outlets such as PBS Nova, The Washington Post, NPR, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Forbes, and the Boston Globe. She currently serves on the Government Policy and Advocacy Committee for the American Society of Human Genetics and the National Academy of Medicine Announces Committee on Emerging Science, Technology, and Innovation. She is a current global chair in Enrich, Equity for Indigenous Research and Innovation Coordinating Hub, which focuses on enhancing Indigenous rights to develop, control, and govern Indigenous data and supports participation in STEM and in digitally enabled futures. It is with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Tsosie to the stage.
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est un plaisir d'être ici. Je voudrais me présenter dans ma langue indigène. Yat Erbene, je ekin chini nishli, do na kaidene pashichin, turchini dash edo tlazaltana dashnele, Krystal Tsosie nishia. Et maintenant, en anglais. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I just introduced myself in Navajo language, which is my language, and you know all of my ancestors in 4 short sentences. And Denepazad, so 3 languages, all in less than 5 minutes. So I first want to start off with acknowledgement to our current Pope, who very recently repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which was huge news for First Nations here in Canada, but was barely a blip on the news radar for Indigenous nations in the US, which is incredibly interesting. But I do want to superimpose this history of the word discovery as it relates to my field in genomics. So first we have this doctrine through papal bulls, which gave European nations superseding rights over us barbarous nations, over our lands, our resources, our territories, our data upon discovery, which was unfortunately upheld by the US Supreme Court a couple of times to support the disenfranchisement of our land and our claims to resources for our communities, even as recently as 2005, in which this doctrine was used to particularly remove historic land rights from the Oneida Nation upon ruling. So repeatedly, we see over time that this doctrine has been used by settlers and settler institutions as a means for co-opting our traditional ecological knowledges and our plant wisdoms as part of this discovery. So I also want to highlight that biology in itself is intrinsically colonial. There are a lot of questions that and concerns from Indigenous peoples that usually we have over and over throughout history. See settlers coming into Indigenous and African Indigenous communities and taking plant knowledges and wisdoms and claiming it as their own discovery. Here we have the ceiling of the Natural History Museum in London, which has pictures of these different botanical plants that have derived different medicinal uses for humans over since discoveries. But we neglect to mention that these plant knowledges and medicinal wisdoms have been practiced for time immemorial, such that even our more modern inventions or uses like quinine were derived from shamans who were sometimes just imprisoned from practicing their own cultures and their means of medicines. I also want to highlight this interesting dynamic that we see in big agriculture, in that prior to settlers arriving into this particular continent, we had a large number of biodiversity. We had an estimated number of 30,000 edible plant species worldwide. And it wasn't upon contact that Indigenous peoples' systems were considered backwards or primitive. Yet we forget that many of our cash crops and medicines are derived from colonized lands and knowledges. Then we have the so-called Green Revolution, which was meant to save us and save mankind from famine and end worldwide hunger. And yet we see that now we have a huge biodiversity loss of 80%. And that big agricultural and monocultural practices have contributed to a third of greenhouse gas emissions, have contributed to the degradation of local ecosystems, and have really entrenched and widened these power inequities related to wealth as concentrated by corporations. And when we see this it's really interesting because nowadays we are looking to Indigenous knowledges to save us from ourselves. You see headlines about how can we use Indigenous knowledges to save X? And now our knowledges are considered key to sustainability. There's a lot of interest in using CRISPR and gene editing technologies to rescue big agriculture, to reintroduce biodiversity. And there's a lot of interest in utilizing Indigenous held seed banks and varietals to reintroduce that variation. But there's a concern here that this will perhaps be a next sort of colonial movement toward taking wisdoms that have been held by Indigenous peoples, and also just highlighting the strange irony that the same systems that were deemed to be backwards and primitive are now key to our future. So I like to describe the big data movement as sort of the Oprahfication of data. Good luck translating that in French. But we see this over and over again that, in order to advance X, in order to advance biomedicine, in order to advance science, we need more data that is freely and openly accessible. So you can imagine for Indigenous peoples, we hear, oh, there's a genome for you under your chair, an Indigenous genome for you. Look under your chair, there's more DNA that's taken from Indigenous peoples for your benefit. But we do not understand that even though in the non-Indigenous realm, there's this uptake in wanting open and freely accessible data, that on the other hand, Indigenous nations have created policies and laws and moratoria that have restricted the collection of data and knowledges from our communities, particularly because of these entrenched, strained trust relations. So how do we, resolve this? How do we move forward, especially when we consider that now, just 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by Indigenous peoples who constitute less than 5% of the world's populations. What this means is that the next genomic discoveries may co-opt Indigenous knowledges or continue disenfranchising Indigenous peoples who are often the last to benefit and also least protected from intellectual property claims. We ask, of course, for whose benefit is this data serving? Oftentimes, Indigenous peoples hear, that upon collection of their data and their DNA, that some way, somehow in the future, this is going to derive and lead to community benefit, be it therapeutics or medicines to cure the communities for the conditions that are ailing them. And yet, time and time again, we see that the first entities to benefit first are not the community members that provided that data, but rather other entities, likely the entities that are also able to benefit monetarily. So of course, this question is, if Indigenous peoples are not benefiting from their traditional knowledges, then who is? Because if we're thinking about equity, then we also need to ensure that the benefits of that data are also distributed fairly. I want to give a couple of quick case studies relating to this colonization of data taken from Indigenous peoples. So this is a compound that was purified and from a plant in which scientists actually learned from the traditional knowledge keepers of different communities in the French Guiana area, that from their practiced plant wisdoms, that there was this anti-malarial that members have been using for quite some time. And upon learning this plant knowledge, actually purified the compound and applied for a patent, which was then awarded. But in no time during this process was the source of that knowledge actually attributed back to the community members. And when this situation emerged in the press, it backfired on the researchers, and other leaders and thought experts stated that in order to obtain the prior and free consent of the informants, that the situation has raised ethical issues that is very reminiscent of that colonial area. And that if we want to move beyond these systems of inequities, we need to really think about what that respect looks like for those sources of that knowledge and wisdom. So I also want to highlight a more practiced and widespread knowledge that we see entering into the cultural zeitgeist. So this is a quote from Dr. Adrienne King, who herself is Indigenous to the Cherokee Nation, who writes about white sage, that the sale of Native spirituality is easily $1 million industry, not even including all the culture vultures and white shamans who sell fake ceremony. So here we have white sage, which is practiced, utilized as a cleansing ritual for many Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And this is something that even a Lakota elder was imprisoned for in the late 1800s for practicing and disseminating this plant knowledge to his peoples for their benefit of their health. And yet now we see that this plant is being marketed at like such a huge scale that even Indigenous peoples can't get access to it. So we see entities like Walmart who are selling these smudging sticks and selling ceremony to the mainstream non-Indigenous peoples, such that there is a white sage black market of individuals who are entering territorial lands and pulling sage brushes by the root in garbage bags in the cover of night, just so they can sell to these entities. And it's so popular that you can't even get it at Walmart or other entities. And we see is actually this next step in literature in that popular, highly impactful publications with worldwide reputations are now publishing and having interest in the sequence of salvia, and really highlighting this focus on the therapeutic properties and the medicinal activities of this plant. So you can kind of see the story starting to unfold before our very eyes, this pathway from traditional knowledges to then potential exploitation. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that one particular knowledge system is always prioritized and legitimized in IP and trademark and copyright claims over other knowledge systems, especially when we consider that oftentimes the sources of those knowledges are often the same, and that it's derived from Indigenous knowledges, but yet for some reason, Indigenous scientific and medicinal practices are not validated in the same way as Western constructs. So the paths to rights and attributions then is incredibly unequal and unilaterally benefits one system. This is a meme from the movie Despicable Me. I don't know if you remember the scene in which the main character Gru is walking down the Lehman Brothers bank, and all the different pillars are continuing squishing this individual. So you can kind of imagine reading this slide in that same order from left to right, in that we really have to question whether or not there's a legal representation equity in terms of the entities who are claiming IP, and whether or not the system is stacked against Indigenous peoples. And what I mean by that is universities are well protected in the US for their ability to claim ownership from federally funded research through the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. And unsurprisingly, a large number of universities have huge legal teams assembled to protect that right for claiming IP. And corporations, notwithstanding, also have large legal teams. But it's really interesting because corporations can access publicly and openly and freely accessible data sets, but then also hide behind that proprietary veil. So the access to information and data unilaterally benefits this entity over the other two entities. And then when we think about Indigenous peoples and communities, the story is just not the same. The existence of Indigenous peoples sometimes are not even legally recognized by colonial governments. The concept of ownership is also sometimes incongruent with Indigenous worldviews that value relationality and kinship and stewardship. And also, it's really hard to claim novelty for practices that were practiced by Indigenous peoples for time immemorial, for centuries of wisdoms that have been passed down by generations. And notwithstanding too, I have to mention that there are a lot of layers of expertise required for an intellectual property lawyer to add to that bioscience knowledge, and then also knowledge of law at the interface of tribal law and federal and state law. You are really looking for a unicorn, but honestly, when you take a tribal lawyer and stack them against an entire university legal team or corporation team, there's a huge power inequity here in terms of legal representation and power. And it's one that needs to be acknowledged if we're going to validate one means of knowledge over another. So I've been sort of circling around this definition, but haven't actually explicitly stated it. And this is this concept of Indigenous genomic data sovereignty, which is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to exercise authority, agency, and autonomy to protect their interests related to their data. And I just want to highlight and underscore that this sovereignty is intrinsically defined by the community and not extrinsically or colonially defined. This is incredibly important, especially in the terms of biodiversity label, because biodiversity data, because we have an international recognition through the Nagoya Protocol, which is a framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which formalizes this fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the knowledge of biodiversity, and also encompasses this responsibility of stewardship back to Indigenous peoples, in fact, underlying the need for the equitable return of benefits to those providing the samples and data that are held on Indigenous lands. But how are Indigenous peoples supposed to operationalize the Nagoya Protocol, especially when huge entities and global powers like the US haven't even signed on to this framework? So this is where I want to highlight the Native BioData Consortium, which is the first Indigenous-led biological and data repository. It's a research nonprofit in the tribal lands of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in central South Dakota. We are a nonprofit that had started from a very simple premise that Indigenous data should be held on Indigenous lands for research that actually benefits Indigenous peoples. It's really interesting. I want to highlight that when we first announced our existence, that we had a lot of drug companies coming knocking our door and asking, how many Indigenous peoples in your data set and what conditions are you looking at? And they're really interested in our work related to Lakota-specific gene variants as associated to rheumatoid arthritis, because RA is something that afflicts a large portion of the dominant population. But we actually have been holding back on that paper because we know that once it enters the public domain, that the right to protecting that data is going to be really difficult. So we pushed back on these conversations and we asked drug companies, why don't you use Indigenous peoples' gene variants to study conditions that specifically affect Indigenous peoples? Like, how is that for a wild concept? And they stated, well, Indigenous peoples constitute like 3% of the US population. It's not profit generative to think about using our data to help Indigenous peoples. Like, that is a problem when innovation is tied to monetary benefits. Because this is why I hate the word democratizing data. Because if we think about what system of democracy are we prioritizing here? I mean, the US has seen, many years of like the garbage fire that we've called democracy over the past few elections. So that's not a model we should ascribe to. But also, certainly, any system that benefits most is going to continue to disenfranchise the minority. And that includes Indigenous peoples. But when that's the source of data, then we are really talking more about the continued colonialization and colonization of our lands and our wisdoms and our data. So I just want to highlight that point importantly. But one of the great things about structuring this data and having local community data governance is now we're able to think about building data economies in which we are creating data servers and training Indigenous data scientists to helm and steward that data, and also creating policies that privilege and prioritize Indigenous data sovereignty. So on top of our dynamic consent portal, because we're moving beyond broad consent models to dynamic consent and other terms of these adaptive consent models, now, on top of these servers that Indigenous peoples and local community members own and steward, we are able to structure these new technologies as related to machine learning. So we're able to incorporate blockchaining as a means of facilitating sharing of data, but also putting on more explicit rules that place Indigenous peoples at the levers of data decision-making authority for those who read and access our data. But then they're also advancing federated learning, which enables the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' data in data sets for testing algorithms and training models, but without actually giving full access to that data set. So we're moving away from models where you have to just, share, openly share everything, and really thinking about using these more adept tools that are next generation in terms of advancing AI and machine learning, but in a community-based situation. And I also want to highlight that we are also utilizing metadata labels called traditional knowledge and biocultural labels that is advanced by local context, which are these digital markers that are tagged alongside the data so that you can actually start tracking provenance. You can actually start tracking who's sharing the data. And you can also tag it along with use and attribution rules as linked to the communities, so that universities now can tag whether or not they actually have permissions or what level of permissions they have for utilizing and sharing that data. So this is a paper in Cell that we have co-authored in terms of utilizing this blockchain system for operationalizing Indigenous data sovereignty for genomic data. And it requires two things. One, it requires community members having a server that they are able to situate these rules on top of, and then also just having a data governance framework that it pushes Indigenous peoples at the levers of those data decision making powers. And this is something that other Indigenous communities are utilizing in like a non-genomic, non-biosciences fashion, but that Indigenous artists are utilizing so that they can control the and prevent the selling of fraudulently claimed artists products that state that they're from Indigenous artists. So this is something that, even outside of my usual realm, the Indigenous peoples are interested in incorporating for themselves. And this is another paper that came out in Nature Machine Intelligence. Like, these are not small journals that are really highlighting the importance of these tools. But here is our paper about the importance of federated learning for, again, ensuring that we have the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data sets. So we're not contributing to the further erasure of Indigenous peoples in data, but we're just enabling the incorporation of their data on rules that Indigenous peoples are comfortable with. And again, when structured on data sets that are stewarded by Indigenous peoples, we're really thinking about a model that operationalizes Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is just more about local context, which recognizes the inherent sovereignty that Indigenous peoples have over data collected from their lands and waters. And this is just a means of grounding intellectual and cultural property rights alongside that data in terms of IDs that are encrypted alongside genomic sequence information. So we can start thinking in terms of these large open science international collaborations. If we incorporate the inclusion of these types of labels alongside the data, then we can make researchers more keenly aware that Indigenous peoples do have preferences of how their data is being used. So when we start thinking about these technologies stacked upon each other, we're also thinking about the return of a means in which Indigenous peoples can self-sustain and support themselves, because like 99% of Indigenous peoples' lands have been taken away from us. That's a statistic that has been published in Science last year at some point. So our means of structuring economies have been removed away from us. When all of our resources have been ripped away from us, when all of our water has been usurped away from us, how are we supposed to become self-sufficient? This is where we have to think about and recognize data as the global economy that it is. And we start thinking about that and thinking about the human capital in developing Indigenous data scientists and data leaders and data repositories. We really think about bringing back those economies to Indigenous people so they can live. So we're not seeing this export of Indigenous peoples outside of the tribal and community lands, that we're actually seeing them being rehomed and repatriated or rematriated back. So that's when we're talking about data back and land back. So we're really thinking about this data revolution in terms of utilizing machine learning approaches that are accessible for Indigenous peoples, and also ameliorating that digital divide by also facilitating the education and training of our Indigenous leaders, but they're also thinking about more eco-friendly ways for storing that data and thinking more about Indigenous cloud solutions. Because we can no longer ask for Indigenous data without also calling for more proximate benefits. And this is where benefit sharing models are so incredibly important, especially if we're talking about data equity and data access. And we also need to ensure that Indigenous nations are equally empowered for intellectual property claims. And finally, I just want to lead with this last note that if we really want to think about equity and innovation, we have to think about advancing equity among 3 different axes, not just engagement equity in terms of and including more Indigenous peoples, but also in data sets, but also ensuring that they are helmed for those data decisions as agents of their own authority. And that's what I mean by decision-making equity. But we also have to think about benefit equity. And if we are absent progress on any of those 3 axes, then we're defaulting back to a status quo. That equity is both a process and an outcome. It involves uplifting Indigenous data sovereignties commensurate with the power dynamics that have been often used against us. So if we're thinking about data justice and moving forward in an equitable fashion, then we need to think about data innovation in these terms. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Tsosie, for this presentation. I've been asked to kind of moderate the microphone to get some questions to you, but your presentation is so apropos to what we're trying to accomplish today. I mean, you've talked about Indigenous sovereignty, intellectual property, patenting, data ownership, data sovereignty, technology, algorithms, AI. That's all converging international protocols. So I think you're touching on interests for a lot of people in the audience here and online. So the floor is open. If people have any questions, I will guide people to the microphone. We do have someone monitoring questions online as well. But let me maybe get the ball rolling with one question. You talked about a lot of challenges, and you gave one example, which really is quite focused in terms of white sage. Are there any particular areas in the States or internationally where people have used this approach, where you can say there's some hope for success that might be addressing some of the issues here? Are there any kind of examples on the positive end?
So the other example that I gave with the similactone SKE compound, I'm blanking on the full name. Yes, it didn't look very good for the researchers involved. It was a blemish internationally for them, but out of it actually came this recognition for benefit sharing. So after that point, they started working with community members as a means of ensuring that the benefits of the antimalarial compound was actually going to be distributed more equitably to Indigenous peoples. After all, they helped contribute to the creation of that technology. So there were moves to sort of disseminate that therapeutic more widely to community members as a form of benefit sharing. And then also they're just out of this notion of benefit sharing and also profit sharing. There's a conversation of like corporations' responsibility to community members and communities that help in the development of IP. So there's one company called Variant Bio that has pledged 4% of profits from drugs that were developed in partnership with utilizing genomic information from Indigenous communities. And that is like a movement that they're hoping that other corporations will also take forward.
All right, thanks for that. So we have one question here. Is there a microphone? Yes, so we do have microphones in the back. And if I can ask people asking questions to please identify yourselves as well.
Hello, can you hear? Try the other one. Can you hear me? Yeah, that works. So Charlotte Guillard, UK IPO. Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I don't think we see enough of that in the IP community. So I had a question because you started your presentation talking about challenging that the Indigenous community is facing in terms of legal expertise and the cost of these legal expertise, and then you talked about leveraging data storage mechanisms and in particular blockchain to help the Indigenous community gather the data and make sure that they are accountable. Do you think there are additional challenges to that? Because I mean, obviously, this is, that means additional skills that can be far away from, the skills that you need to build this traditional knowledge and understand it and exploit it. So could you talk a little bit about how these challenges can be overcome? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Two things I'll try to remember to bring up. One, the digital divide and the lack of available digital infrastructures is a huge problem. One that was highlighted especially in the pandemic. In a past life, I was a tribal college instructor in Turtle Mountain. And this is a rural community in northern North Dakota, about 10 minutes south of the Canadian border. And a survey went around that stated that tribal college students had about 50% of them had internet at home. So if they wanted to do their homework, they had to go onto campus, which is sometimes can be a trek or journey for those individuals. And they had to be available during the business hours that the college was open. When the pandemic hit, the inequities and disproportionate access to even internet in rural communities was heightened, it was exacerbated. My cousin, for instance, even before the pandemic, would have to drive 45 minutes to the nearest town to access Wi-Fi from a McDonald's parking lot to be able to do her homework. And then as an emergency measure, schools around tribal reservations, instituted Wi-Fi hubs that were poorly powered but got the job done. And out of this, we had Federal CARES Act funds, and a number of tribal communities are utilizing this to create their own communication companies at a large scale, or even just trying to bolster this type of wiring of the res, so to speak. So that's at least a bright spot in that finally there's attention to this digital divide and data infrastructure. The second point that we're working on is the recognition that 1% of Indigenous students pursue higher level degrees in STEM fields, and that is even lower for Indigenous students pursuing degrees in data. So out of this, I and other Indigenous scientists have created a series of workshops called Indigidata, which is meant to train the next generation of Indigenous data science leaders. We actually have 2 workshops this summer, one on gene editing, CRISPR, and food sovereignty as related to Indigenous data sovereignty. And 50% of these workshops are informatics, so coding based, and introducing students to command line programming. And another one that we have is in the Lummi Nation related to fisheries, waterways management, but also qPCR and metabarcoding. So these are ways of training the individuals, and one that universities and corporations can contribute to as donors. But once we start thinking about those long-term challenges of Wi-Fi and students as workforce development, then we can really start thinking about sustainable moves to our futures in our data futures.
All right. Thank you for that. Okay, I see a few hands already. So one mic in the back and then a couple more questions here. Did you want to start? Please. And then we have Nancy and Elias.
Can you guys hear me okay? Dr. Tsosie, thank you so much for that presentation. It really, really resonated with me as a data scientist and a person who believes that First Nations do need to receive recognition and accreditation for their data sources. My question has to do with, as you stated, with data sources and the single source of truth with that accreditation. You stated that sovereignty is obviously a commonality and a goal for basically unifying and making sure that it's beneficial in both sources, or whomever is accessing that data. Can you comment or provide any kind of input when it comes to when that data, that single source of truth that comes from First Nations, Indigenous knowledge, is, I guess, diverted or I guess spread into various areas that may conflict with the First Nations way of life, and as well as their knowledge basically is not retained appropriately. Thank you.
No, what I'm hearing is more a question about the division, so to speak, between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge, or Western science and Indigenous science. And I do want to remind that common to both is this word science, which is that science is a protocol. It's a means of, through repeated observations and experiential learning, testing hypotheses, right? And even for, like for instance, in paleogenomics and ancient DNA, there's a lot of questions about using DNA from Indigenous peoples to sort of learn this truth with a capital T about humans' migrations out of Africa. And we forget that there are actually a lot of different competing hypotheses, even within the non-Indigenous Western world, about those movements, those population movements. And those papers that come out of these top ancient DNA labs that concentrate a lot of this scientific money and authority into these few labs are, also benefiting from the one-way movement of data outside of Indigenous communities and nations out of the global South into labs in the US and Europe, which, there's a huge power dynamic here. And I'm using ancient DNA as sort of an analogy for what we see in other realms. And we forget that with genomics, especially in the population realm, is actually structured on layers of assumptions based in statistics. And statistics itself is, it's a confidence interval. It's a p-value. It's a best informed guess based off of the data that we have. And there's a lot of assumptions that we make in terms of whether or not what truly is random in stochastic models and Bayesian models is actually truly random, or if there's something more structurally creating these biases, right? But, we don't question this as individuals, especially if you're not entrenched in and knowing what these statistical models are, or if you even know how to unpack a method section about one of these densely worded papers, and you kind of, if you're a lay person or a member of the public, you view these things as validated by experts. So we just have to acknowledge that there's a lot of powers that are privileged onto one knowledge system versus another. And Indigenous knowledges, on the other hand, same thing. They were in that process of hypothesis generation and testing. And a lot of that was cut short due to genocide and other types of huge population and lifestyle changes imposed on our peoples. So, in many senses, a lot of that entrenched knowledge, the pathway for that knowledge generation was halted. So it's a little disingenuous to compare one versus another, especially without considering, again, that science as a whole is just that process of hypothesis generation and testing. So yes, maybe there are some instances in which, one interpretation of data may not match another group's interpretation of data, right? But this is a point of conversation that could be moved forward if we think about having equity in those conversations. But if we don't have equity in those conversations, then we're denying ourselves an opportunity to be able to really move forward with progress with a capital P. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Galini.
Hi. Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. It's really exciting, the work you're doing. So I'm Nancy Galini from the University of British Columbia. And you started out by talking about the Nagoya Protocol and how you needed to operationalize that, which is really interesting because the Convention on Biological Diversity is really kind of a government to government thing, right? And so it wasn't clear how protective the Indigenous groups were. So I thought that was really interesting. And then you led into one of the mechanisms were these data repositories. And it's amazing the work you're doing in this area. And I was wondering, some of these repositories, like the one in India, has been really influential. There's been some papers, I think one by Chowdhury in Canada, to show that when these data sets are made available to patent authorities, that in fact the research changes in that they become, a lot of the medicines now are less based on traditional knowledge than they are on maybe synthetic. So it's actually encouraged innovation because the patent authorities have these data sets available showing that this stuff has already been made, through Indigenous groups and so on. And so I'm just wondering, with these data sets can be kind of defensive, and they can also be sort of proactive in rewarding intellectual property rights to the traditional knowledge. But two questions I have are, the first one is, how are these data sets formed? Like, how involved are the Indigenous communities in determining what goes in those data sets? And then the second question I have is, listening to you, I was trying to figure out what components of the intellectual property regime could work for traditional knowledge. And as you pointed out, it's kind of hard to determine who the owners are. And it's also, because it's been passed through generations, that maybe the novelty element may not work. So are you suggesting, or could we say that maybe there needs to be a sui generis approach for intellectual property to protect traditional knowledge? Or what you were kind of describing with these partnerships with private companies or with pharmaceutical companies and other research groups, you were sort of describing something that sounded a little bit like trade secrets and contracts. And so I'm just trying to figure out, is there any component of the current intellectual property regime that can be used to protect traditional knowledge? So the two questions, one is, how are these data sets formed? And the second one is there any hope for the intellectual property regime for protecting traditional knowledge?
So I do want to, I learned so much from stepping out of my own comfort zone in genomic data to look at, particularly human genomic data, to look at other types of data. And one thing I've definitely learned, though, is that the risks for different data types are not the same. So we can learn about governance of different data and structuring models, but we also have to acknowledge that just all data has different risks. So for instance, with like health data, for instance, that's data that might individually re-identify one person. And, it's easy to think about consenting an individual for having informed knowledge of the risks and benefits for that one person. But then when you start thinking about like particularly human genomic data, you know, that question of risks and benefits and privacy and consent get different. You know, there's a lot of it gets complicated because then, you know, genomic data has the ability to re-identify everyone that we're biologically related to. So then, you know, in terms of risks, you have the potential for genomic racial profiling, especially for members of small underrepresented communities. You have risks for just re-identifying communities and making these potentially negative stereotypes and assumptions based off of a person's genome from one person, right? So we have to be very careful and not just thinking about data as a global monolith, but also being really sensitive to those risks. And we know that in terms of patenting technologies derived from the human genome, that this space has been contested back and forth with rulings. And there's, of course, murmuring that we're going to have yet another overturn of previously overturned rulings in the US Supreme Court, for instance. So this is a very scary domain. So that's not a great answer for your first question, I acknowledge. But the second question is there a space for IP in terms of how Indigenous peoples use it? There are different schools of thought. Some decolonial Indigenous scholars say no, absolutely not, because the concept of ownership is fundamentally different from our concept of stewardship. And to some effect, I agree with some of those statements, but then also, you know, Indigenous peoples do have the ability to exercise sovereignty, and they want to utilize IP to protect their knowledges and wisdoms. There needs to be a place for that. And there are some communities, particularly like in Native Hawaiian, that want to utilize essentially IP or trademarking on taro, which is a plant that's important for their community. But then you get into colonial recognition, those types of questions. So yes and no, that's just the summation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. You do have just a couple of minutes left. If there are any key questions anyone would like to ask. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, for your question. My name is Shruti, and I'm from Australian IP office. This is an area where we are also deeply thinking in Australia, and I'm coming from an examiner perspective to this issue here. So you did mention the SKE example where a EP office granted a patent. So I think for us examiners, a big barrier that I can see is to identify whether traditional knowledge was involved in the development and the patent application. So identifying if there was some traditional knowledge involved in a particular application, whether it be patent or a trademark, is a big barrier that we face at the moment. You did say that there are these data repositories that we can use, and professor from the university said that India has a database which we can kind of use, but in the absence of these things, I think that is the biggest barrier for us. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great concern. My lab is actually updating the results of a scoping review we did on peer-reviewed literature related to ancient DNA. Again, one of my areas. But the question was like, how much is community engagement of Indigenous peoples being disclosed on peer-reviewed literature? And that disclosure could mean either the engagement wasn't done at all, or it was done, we just don't know about it, right? And that's the central part of your question. We learned that just 25% of papers in the last 10 years actually have some element of community engagement. And it can be incredibly minimal, like sending a participant to a workshop to get trained. So there's space to improve upon. One, in disclosing it, and also in being more open to that disclosure as part of like our methods, but then also for really just having like true equitable inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the research process. But the other part of your question was like how do we be respectful of traditional knowledges absent some of those local partners? And this is where perhaps data harmonization might be a key role. So there are actually a lot of databases related to ethnobotany, ethnomedicine, historical records, museum archives. It's just that when we get into our own domains and our own heads, and we only have like a limited purview of like what data sets are available in our discipline, we deny ourselves the opportunity to be open to the fact that this data might have been already collected somewhere else that has provenance information. We just need to be able to know how to collect it. So this is where I'm really excited for interdisciplinary partners included as part of the research process, and that we can actually start thinking about utilizing these other sets for thinking about provenance of knowledges from Indigenous communities. Thank you.
All right. Look, thanks, Dr. Tsosie, for this presentation. I think we're just, scratching the surface here of how deep this issue is. I think all of the work that you've done and are doing to advance data sovereignty in this area can only serve to improve the overall system of benefits and intellectual property. So with that, let's all express our appreciation for Dr. Tsosie for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you.